Vamos a pasar ahora a la parte central de la presentación. El tema central que hemos elegido es el dilema geopolítico de Israel. Estará a cargo del profesor Shlomo Hasson. El profesor Shlomo Hasson es profesor de geografía y además ha sido durante muchos años consultor internacional en el desarrollo de las comunidades, especializado en un trabajo de campo de las relaciones y desarrollo de comunidades conjuntas entre israelíes y palestinos. El doctor Hasson va a hacer la presentación central y, como dije antes, al comienzo, luego van a tener un diálogo fructífero con el doctor Emilio Cárdenas. El doctor Emilio Cárdenas es ex embajador de la República Argentina ante las Naciones Unidas y es una persona sumamente conocida por todos nosotros, pero además muy versada en las relaciones internacionales, y esto está relacionado con el tema que vamos a tratar. Así que, profesor Shlomo, doctor Cárdenas.
Good evening, dear friends of the Hebrew University, distinguished guests. I am honored and pleased to be here this evening and to share with you my thoughts about Israel's geopolitical dilemma and the future borders of Israel. So what is Israel's geopolitical dilemma? To put it in one sentence, I would say, how could Israel ensure its existence as a Jewish and democratic state within secure and recognized borders? This is the central dilemma facing Israel today. And if you examine this dilemma and you look carefully into it, you realize that at least 4 parameters are involved in this problem. The parameter of demography, which means Jewish majority in the state of Israel, the parameter of democracy, human rights, geography, territorial depth, and security, and obviously the 4th dimension is international legitimacy. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, which map would provide us the optimal balance between the 4 variables, and which process is going to lead us in this direction? Is it a process of agreement, or maybe a process of unilateral actions, or even conflict? So which map and which policy? And then we have to ask ourselves, which forces are going to shape the map and are going to shape the policy? What are the driving forces? So to recapture what I'm talking about a central geopolitical dilemma, and I'm raising 3 questions. One relates to the map, the second relates to the process, the political process, and the third to the forces, the driving forces. Now, there is nothing new about this dilemma. It has been with us since the beginning of Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel in the new era. It reappeared in 1937 with the Peel Commission. It reappeared in 1947 with the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. It reappeared after 1967, but today it appears in a different way because everything has changed in the Middle East. We are witnessing a dramatic upheaval in the Middle East. The global powers are not the same. The Middle East, the regional powers are not the same. There are changes in the Arab world. There are changes in the relations between Israelis and Palestinians. And there are internal changes in the 2 societies. So when we ask ourselves the question about the geopolitical dilemma, the map, the process, and the forces, we have to take into consideration the dramatic changes that appear in the Middle East. And what I would like to do this evening is to invite you, first of all, to a short journey into the Israeli imagination, the way different groups within Israel try to solve the geopolitical dilemma by suggesting different maps. Then I would like to consider the forces in the Middle East that may shape the maps, and finally to come up with several future scenarios. So the first map that all of us are quite familiar with is the 67 borders. There is a large camp in Israel that strongly believe that this is the right way to solve Israeli geopolitical dilemma. Israel has to withdraw from the West Bank. Obviously, it has done it in the Gaza Strip. And there should be some territorial swaps. And you can see the two maps. The first map on the right is the map that I grew up with. It was hanged in the school. And then the second map is the Geneva Initiative that shows you the territorial swaps. And this is a map that the Labour Party believes in. This is the map that President Obama believes in. And there are very strong arguments why we should move in this direction, because Israel is isolated today. And if Israel stays within the West Bank, people warned us, it's going to radicalize the Arab world. It's going to strengthen Iran. It's going to change the demography in favor of the Palestinians, so the Jews will turn into a minority in the area between the river and the sea. So it's in Israel's interest to withdraw from the West Bank, to recognize borders, agreed upon borders. And this is the vision that President Obama put forward in May 2011, when he said that if Israel withdraw, this would help to strengthen Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority. It would reduce the power of Iran and of the extremists, and it would turn Israel and the Palestinian into an economic dynamo, a brain dynamo that moves the Middle East forward. This is a very inspiring vision. But there are many in Israel that are saying, well, but you tend to avoid the problems that surround us. See what's happening with Iran. Iran is engaged in a nuclear race. See the changes in the Arab world, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. And if, God forbids, Israel finds itself in a war, and these hostile forces cross the river and come to the hills that overlook, you know, the central plain of Israel, you can see on the map on the left how close the airports of Israel are to the missiles of those hostile forces. It is about 10 kilometers from Ben Gurion Airport. And you have to remember that 70% of Israeli population is living in the coastal plain, so it's going to put the entire land of Israel under an imminent threat coming from the hostile forces. And therefore, this map suggests that Israel should stay along the Jordan River, and you can see the Jordan River to the right. There should be settlements there. There should be a corridor leading from Jerusalem to the Jordan River. And this map was put forward by Yigal Allon already in 1967. Please remember, Yigal Allon was a member of the Labour Party. And then Rabin, a few weeks before he was assassinated, said that in any peace agreement, Israel is going to stay in the Jordan Valley, along the Jordan Valley, in the broadest sense of this term. And I think that today, the person who symbolizes the essence of this solution is Benjamin Netanyahu. Because Benjamin Netanyahu, in his book, A Place Among the Nations, made it very clear that we need the Jordan Valley. He didn't refer to other parts of the West Bank, but he referred to the Jordan Valley and to the hills overlooking the Jordan Valley. And I think that this is his philosophy of defensible borders, much like Rabin and alone. The third solution is provided by Kadima, parties associated with the center. It was provided by Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert. And the idea here is that Israel has no partner, so if Israel fails to reach an agreement with the Palestinian, it must withdraw unilaterally to interim borders, and the security barriers, of which about 80% has already been completed, would be a sort of an interim border for Israel. Because according to this view, the major threat to Israel is not Iran, is not the Muslim Brotherhood. The major threat to Israel is the changing demography. And this is why Israel has to withdraw to these borders. On the right-hand side, you can see the map that Olmert presented to Mahmoud Abbas in 2008 in Annapolis. And if you compare the two maps, you can see that they are almost similar. Withdrawal to the security barriers. There is a fourth group in Israel who say that all the maps that I showed you are wrong. It's not going to work. Why? Because the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a protracted and unresolved conflict. Israel created a new situation in the West Bank. You can see the distribution of Jewish settlements across the West Bank. And this is an irreversible situation. So the only solution, according to this camp, is a binational state, a secular democratic state, so they believe, that would be established between the Jordan River and the sea. Those who support this idea are people to the far left, some post-Zionists and anti-Zionists, and some Arab parties. You have a map on the left, which is produced by Shalom Achshav. And Shalom Achshav is a Zionist left-wing NGO, and they heavily criticize the map that I showed you because they are saying that this is going to be the end of Israel, because you start with a binational state and you end up with a Muslim state in which the Jews will be a minority. Finally, the last map is produced by Gush Emunim, by Moetzet Yesha, by the Vaad Yeshuvim, by the right-wing parties, and they think that the only solution is to dismantle the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority is an imminent threat to Israel, and we have to annex, Israel has to annex most of the area of the West Bank. You can see the white area, which is over 60% of the land. And the Palestinians would be in these small pockets that you see, the green shaded pockets here on the wall. This would be a sort of cantons run by Palestinians. They may have some of them will become Israeli citizens, some of them may be Jordanian citizens, some of them might be transferred, but this is the solution of Naftali Bennett and those people who strongly believe in the greater land of Israel. And the major issue is here security. So I would like to capture the essence of the different maps by a very simple diagram that looks at the political process, the policy action, whether it's conflict or agreement, and the geographic, territorial action, whether it's convergence or expansion. And you can see that the 67 borders implies convergence and agreement, and it leads to conflict resolution. The blurred borders of the post-Zionist means conflict transformation. The conflict is transformed into something else. The greater land of Israel is conflict termination, the end of the conflict by dismantling the Palestinian Authority. And finally, the interim agreement and defensible borders is conflict management. Now, if you look at this map carefully, you can see the problem of the coming elections. If you ask ourselves, where is Bibi Netanyahu? I would say that Bibi Netanyahu is on the upper right-hand quartile. He's right there, and he has two options. Either to ally himself with Naftali Bennett, and there is the idea of greater land of Israel, or with those people who believe in interim solution and the 1967 borders. And no one can tell you for sure what he is going to do after the elections, but this is, in my view, the major issue of the elections. Which map is going to be produced after the elections? A map which leads to convergence, or a map of expansion? A map which is built on agreement, or perhaps on conflict? And the problem with Israelis, and I'm sure that all of you had an opportunity to argue with Israeli, is that each group believes that it has the right answer. You talk to people of the 67 borders and they say, we have the right answer because ethics, morality, progress is on our side. You talk to the people of defensible borders and they say, we read history in the right way because for security and military consideration, we should be along the Jordan Valley. You talk to people of interim borders and they say the most important issue is demography. Blurred borders, it's an irreversible situation. And if you talk to people of the greater land of Israel, they would say, God is on our side. This is a divine promise. The children of Israel were promised this land. We have historic rights, and this is a national decree, national imperative. And this is, in my view, if you look at this interpretation, this is the essence of the dilemma that we have today in Israel, because each group believes that it knows what is good for Israel, what is good for everybody, and when you argue with them, they will try to explain to you why you are wrong. And they will explain to you. If you understand and you shift your view and you are on their camp, that's fine. If you don't, okay, this is because you are either an ideologue or reactionary or just a silly person. There is no alternative to this. There is always strong believers. So when people are talking about true believers, what I'm trying to say is that the true believers are everywhere, not only on one camp. They are on every camp because every group believes that it has a monopoly over wisdom. Now, as an academic who work at the Hebrew University, I have to report about the different views, about the different beliefs, without passing any judgment. It's not my duty to pass judgment. I can do it as a citizen. What I can say is that I have the highest respect to every ideology. I have the highest respect to every ideology. And there is no doubt that ideology exerts some influence on reality. It shapes reality to a certain extent. But there are some other forces at work, global forces, regional forces, and unfortunately, we tend to ignore these forces and to play down their influence on the future map of Israel. So what I would like to do now, very briefly, to review the different forces and to show you how they are going to affect the realizations of the different maps. First of all, we have to look at the superpowers, and we have to look at the role of the United States, the declining role of the United States. China is entering the Middle East. The European Union would like to be there through the neighborhood agreement and through the Barcelona process to stabilize the region. And we have now a new game between the superpowers, who is going to control the economic resources, especially oil, and strategic position. Then we have another set of powers which is associated with the regional power. We have Iran and we have Turkey, and they may collide with each other over territorial hegemony, regional hegemony. We have also Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And the major conflict here is the conflict between the Sunnites and the Shiites. This is a long-standing conflict, and no one can ignore it. The third development is the development in the Arab world. In 2011, we were promised an Arab Spring, the toppling of autocrats. We thought perhaps about the possibility of having an Arab summer, democracy. But see what's going on right now in the Arab world, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt. You see the rise of the extremist groups, of the Muslim Brotherhood, and who knows what's going to happen in Syria, you know, if this conflict continues there. And therefore, the demographic changes, the economic changes in the Arab world do not necessarily promise us a beautiful rosy summer. It may turn out into a severe winter. And finally, the relations between Israel and Palestine. We thought for many years when we signed the Oslo Accord that very soon we'll have an agreement. Next year, we will celebrate 20 years of this Oslo Agreement. And if you follow what happened, it is very disappointing. Very disappointing. There is no agreement. Actually, we are on the verge of the new intifada. And the two governments are not willing to take the risks. The public is very interesting. Public opinion says we support the idea of two-state solution. 57% of the Israeli public support the idea of two-state solution, but about the same percentage argues that it's not going to happen soon. Why? Because we don't trust the Palestinians. And the same picture appears on the Palestinian side. And demography is changing in favor of the Palestinians. And on both sides, we have people who object the peace process. And it's going to be extremely difficult to have a peace agreement in the short run because of the refugees problems, the Jerusalem problems, the borders problems, the security problems, the fact that the Palestinians are unwilling to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, the fact that we have a deep rift between Hamas and Fatah. So if you look at the map that I'm showing you here, this is a conceptual map. This is a map that showed you a system with many actors, and the challenge is to make sense out of it. And this is the way I'm going to make sense out of it. By looking at two dimensions, two axes. One axis is the conflict, the horizontal axis, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. It moves from left to right, from conflict to agreement. And then the vertical axis is the conflict in the Middle East. And once again, it moves from agreement to conflict. And we have here 4 scenarios, and I would like to review the scenarios very briefly. The first scenario, I call it American peace, Pax Americana. In this scenario, America becomes once again the leading power in the Middle East. We have regional cooperation between Israel and Turkey. Iran witnesses some democratic reforms. In the Arab world, you have a democratic summer, and the two governments, the Israeli and Palestinian governments, are willing to sign an agreement, and this would be an agreed upon borders, the 67 borders. And as you can see, the chances of this to happen soon are very slim because reality is moving in the opposite direction. Some people argue that reality is moving in this direction, which is a Muslim caliphate. You have the rise of Muslim parties. Turkey is there. And if you follow the last Israeli operation in Gaza, you could see that at the end of this operation, the Israeli security forces, the Turkish security forces, the Egyptian security forces, with the support of the United States, were negotiating a kind of a ceasefire with some impact on Hamas, bringing Hamas in. This is not the end of the conflict, but this is a sort of an interim agreement, an interim border. There is a third scenario in which every state, every party is fighting the other party. So there are conflicts within the states between religious groups, between Alawites and Sunnites in Syria, between liberals and Muslim brotherhoods in Egypt, even in Israel, between Arabs and Jews. And this is a situation that I called anarchy. And in a situation of anarchy, the Israeli government would seek to reduce the anarchy perhaps by reaching a sort of an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, making some concessions, withdrawing from some territories, and ending up with something which is very close to defensible borders. So this is the situation of anarchy, and at the moment it seems that the Middle East is moving in this direction of anarchy. And finally, the fourth scenario is a scenario in which Iran and Turkey are isolated. They create a sort of an alliance. Iran would have the nuclear bomb. Pakistan may join in, maybe North Korea, and we cannot rule out the possibility of clash of civilizations with the support of extremist groups. If the Muslim Brotherhood fails, the Salafis will come in Egypt and see what's going on in Syria right now. And under these conditions, no one would expect Israel to withdraw from territories. It would remain with the detrimental results of changing demography in favor of the Palestinians. And obviously, everything might happen. We may sign an agreement, go to the 67 borders, and just to discover that the people who came to power are the extremists, the national religious parties, and it might deteriorate into a severe conflict, so we may end up with blurred borders. So we have to prepare ourselves to different developments and to ask ourselves, what is Israel's interest, given the different possibilities? Nobody can forecast the future. The role of scenarios is not to forecast the future. The role of scenarios is to make you sensitive to different developments. So what are the prospects of the different scenarios? I would say Pax Americana is slim, Muslim Caliphate and interim agreement moderate, anarchy and defensible borders, it's quite high, and clash of civilizations and blurred border, it might happen, but at the moment it's moderate. So what are the conclusions? The conclusions are that when we discuss the future map of Israel, we have to reconsider our position in the Middle East. And the Middle East is going to be an unstable area for a long time. And therefore, the prospects of ending the conflict in the short run are very slim, maybe in the long run. And developments are at the different geopolitical levels are moving at different paces. Okay, they are moving at different paces. The fast movements are registered at the global and regional level, and the slow movements are at the local level. And this is why Israel must prepare itself for a new situation in which policymakers, army officers, think not only about the immediate surrounding, but also the remote environment. We have to prepare ourselves to a conflict that spreads over several geopolitical levels. It will be a multidimensional conflict. What are the implications? The implications are that, first of all, what is desired by most Israelis, 57% of Israelis, the two-state solution, cannot be reached in the short run. And what could be reached in the short run, the binational state, is not desired. So hence, we have to come up with a third way, another initiative. And what is this initiative? Actually, while I was working at the Shasha Center under Ephraim Halevi, we sent this recommendation to Bibi Netanyahu. And we said that the status quo is not an option, because the status quo is the end of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And the Palestinians should not be given a veto right over Israel's existence as a Jewish and democratic state. So Israel must take the initiative. It's very clear that it is either partial agreement of interim borders or defensible borders through unilateral actions. These are the two major options that we put on the table, and Israel must ensure security and legitimacy. So what is the prospect? What is the world in 2030? I would say that the future map is probably defensible borders in one way or another. In one way or another, Israel would maintain the Jerusalem corridor leading to the Jordan Valley, and there would be Jewish presence in one way or another along the Jordan Valley. And the future trends, unfortunately, are not agreement, but unilateral acts taken by the two parties and mutual adaptation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. First, thank you for the Hebrew University's invitation to join you people. This is not the first time I'm here, and let me just start by saying that this is, in a day, the second presentation by Shlomo of the same slides that I have seen. I enjoyed the second presentation even more than the first presentation. This is a spectacular analytical tool to look at the various options that the future of Israel is confronted with. And if I have to try to identify basic, fundamental agreements between what Shlomo has said and what I believe, is first, here the word is uncertainty. Second, just stand and look at the status quo is unacceptable. Third, the best possible options for peace are remote today. They are still there, and it is worth for the international community to push forward with the 1967 basic ideas. 1967 is different from 2013, so it has to be reshaped. But to push forward those ideas before those ideas fade away. The risk is that if that stays in the books or in a corner of Shlomo's analytical schemes, it may weaken and weaken as time goes by. I was criticized by some of my friends in the audience last time I was here because I did not talk about Palestine. I think that today I have the chance to share with you some of my views on that group, on that nation. First, Israel doesn't have a partner yet. Palestine is divided. And it's divided in such a fashion that it's very hard to have in the bargaining table the two views of the two major Palestine groups. Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas seem to be able to sit down and recognize Israel as a counterpart. Hamas today doesn't seem to be in that position. Much to the contrary, has not moved from his negation of the right of Israel to exist as a state. Yes, if you look at what's going on, you will find signals of rapprochement between the two groups. I think that most of us were shocked, not only when Hamas had a political party in the West Bank, but we were even more shocked a week ago when in Gaza, Fatah was able to put together a group that some people believe was close anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million people in a 1.7 million group of Palestinians inside Gaza with the yellow flags of Fatah. That was unheard of. After the events of 2006 and 2007, it was very hard to imagine that this could occur. Now, today, in Cairo, Mahmoud Abbas met with Khaled Meshal at the request of President Morsi, and according to the first comments on the outcome of the meeting, they simply went nowhere. The way they look at the peace process is still entirely different. Negotiating with Hamas, which is considered by the West as a terrorist group, which still has ties with Iran and more recently with Qatar. I mean, the Iranian ties are mostly the concern. It's hard to imagine unless we have a unified party on the other side of the table. The Palestinians are today, and that's another factor, if you want, riding a high for two reasons. Both parts of the Palestinians can consider that they have achieved significant victories recently. Hamas believes that the 8 days fights of last November was a fight which they won, even if the fight was luckily interrupted, because they were able to aim at major Israeli cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem with the Fahar 5 missiles provided by Iran. On the other side, Mahmoud Abbas can claim that he's the father of the country, now that also in November he obtained recognition as an observer state at the United Nations and was celebrated on his return to Palestine, to the West Bank in this case, but he was also congratulated by Hamas, which was kind of surprising. So both sides are today with a favorable wind. Palestinians in roughly 54% believe that they are doing well, both Hamas and Fatah. But if you look at the polls, only less than 40%, I think the figure is 39% of the Palestinians believe that they can rapidly reach an agreement to become a single party on the other side of the table. So today, those options that were described face that very first hurdle. The second hurdle was referred by Shlomo as the situation of the US, which is today still the leading state in the world, but reluctant to move forward alone. The states would like to participate in the peace process as it has done up to now, but not alone, and not under any circumstance. One here statement by President Obama that one must keep in mind when he says, for example, that we, the United States, cannot do more for peace than what the parties are doing. That's caution by definition, and that's caution expressed by a power that seems to be diminishing its world influence. But events go fast, as Shlomo told us, and we're going to have to look in the next forthcoming days for signs as to where the US will go. Without the US trying to resurrect the 1967 proposal, I doubt that that scenario could move forward. And the next, to me, moves to follow carefully are the discussions on the nomination of the new Secretary of Defense of the United States, Chuck Hagel. Some people believe, and probably rightly so, that Chuck, who's a Republican, is sort of very cold on getting his country involved deeply in the peace process now. So much so that when he refers to Israel, he frequently uses a phrase that indicates how distant he wants to be. Instead of talking about Israel, he talks about the Jewish lobby. And that's very different. So that nomination process should be followed, and probably some signs as to whether the US will move forward could be read. To me, the next gigantic question mark is what would be the outcome in Syria. If you look at Syria, is the definition of a sectarian conflict. One cannot be confused. This is not autocracy versus democracy. This is Sunnis versus Shiites. This is Sunnis versus Alawites. And that's the basic fight on the street. And that's why you have Hezbollah fighters inside Syria. And that's why yesterday you saw 48 Iranian prisoners of the rebel forces exchanged for 2,000 prisoners of the governmental forces. For Iran, a defeat in Syria will be dramatic. It will have an impact not only on Iranian support on Hamas, obviously, it will have a direct impact on Hezbollah, and it will have a direct impact on the situation in Lebanon. How shaky is the government of Assad? In my view, extremely shaky. The Russians, about 2 weeks ago, even considered preparing a few ships to make sure that the Russians living today in Syria could be evacuated if the government sort of falls fast. And there are all kinds of possible side events. Syria has, for example, 50 tons of already enriched uranium. If that falls into the hands of Iran, Iran will not have to wait much longer. You have the chemical weapons issue, but you still have Russia and China vetoing systematically at the UN Security Council, making sure that the international community stay hands-off, at least institutionally, from the conflict. And the conflict is deepening because, needless to say, the Saudi Arabians and Qatar are providing money and ammunition to the rebels, and timing, as Shlomo mentioned, here is absolutely unpredictable. Anything can happen in Syria at any time. The third question mark is Egypt. What kind of game is the Muslim Brotherhood playing in foreign policy? It looks moderate for the time being. They are under a lot of pressure from the Salafists. Missiles keep flowing into Gaza. Big lesson for Israel of the events in November is that those about 1,000 tunnels around Rafah are operative, are active, and those missiles are coming in, making the situation more dangerous, making security a bigger problem, and showing that there is a limited commitment by the present Egyptian government to maintain the status quo. You can argue that, on the other hand, when in Sinai events got off hand, they moved very rapidly, to make sure that the radicals did not control the peninsula, and rightly so. But that still is a big question mark. I cannot but have to mention the other big problem. The other big problem is Iran. The calendar in Iran is tricky. As you probably know, they have presidential elections coming in June. It is uncertain who the candidates are going to be. That is not clear. Who the opposition is going to be, who Mr. Rafsanjani candidate will be, which person will be endorsed by him, and what the outcome of the game power between him and Khamenei will be. There is one signal that one could read that suggests that Iran is slowing the race towards conflict. And that has to do with the speed of uranium enrichment, which has come down. There have been used uranium They have, if you want, deflect uranium, which they haven't reached, only to 20% degree, to be used for medical purposes in the reactor the United States gave to the Reza Pahlavi Shah years ago. So that indicates that they are not sort of speeding in getting the amount of enriched uranium at one point we all thought they were going to have to make sure that they become a military nuclear power. And before I talk a little bit about Israel, let me say another game changer is Turkey. When one says Israel is more isolated today than ever before, one has to take into account that Turkey was, I wouldn't say a partner, but friendly, militarily, I mean, trustworthy, participant in joint exercises, a balancing power, sort of cooling down all the radicals. One cannot assume that this is the case today. Since the event of the Mavi Mara, the policy towards Israel has changed. But in addition to that, there is a major upheaval inside Turkey. The nature of Turkey is changing very rapidly. The Turkey of Atatürk, the secular Turkey, is probably gone by today. This is allegedly a moderate Islamic government, but devoted, if you want, to cleaning its own place. I mean, they are putting in jail the military, they are putting in jail a few journalists, they're intimidating the press. I mean, this is not the Turkey it used to be, in a few words, for Israel today. So that's another factor to take into account. So sectarianism is growing, nationalism is growing, and when you have sectarianism and nationalism growing, you have anti-Semitism growing. Even if you don't see, it grows in many corners, including our own region. Israel has elections, as we all know, on the 22nd. If you look at the polls, Netanyahu should win. About Knesset has 120 seats. Figures suggest that he will get 67, and the opposition, if you want to call it left-wing opposition, it's not rightly so, but the opposition will get the other 53. As mentioned by Shlomo, there's a new player, and that is Naftali Bennett. He may get probably 15 seats. He could claim today he has between 5 and 7, with the small party he somehow controls, and he may get those 15 seats, but he will put pressure on Netanyahu in a variety of different ways. By the way, Bennett is not a foreign person to Netanyahu. In fact, Bennett has worked for Netanyahu from 2006 to 2008. He's another millionaire, by the way. He's a very successful, technology millionaire. He specialized in banking security, and he sold a company he had in the US before immigrating to Israel for something about $145 million. So money is not a concern for him. But he has charisma. And he represents a group that in the charter we looked at, today will simply say, this is not going to happen. We're going to have to live with permanent conflict. We better find a different way. And that's an alternative. I agree with Shlomo, is probably not the best alternative, but who knows what the real alternative is going to be. Because we can all have wishful thinking. Problem is that we cannot anticipate which way the events will go. But needless to say, Israel has 7.5 million people surrounded by, I think, 325 million hostile people, including the Iranians. Israel is still very strong, has to keep a constant eye on its own problem. The feeling that it is us who have to decide what's best for our future and our security is growing inside Israel, and rightly so. In the meantime, the other Israel, the domestic Israel, is growing. You mentioned a few examples of scientific and technological advance. The Israel Embassy in Buenos Aires has just published and distributed a very small but very impressive booklet with about 150, to use a baseball word, strikes in the scientific world by Israel lately, really astonishing. But on a per capita basis, Israel has the highest number of orchestras, the higher number of museums, the higher number of zoos, the higher number of graduates, the higher number of scientific publications. And I think that is the strength of Israel, and that's what Israel can offer if there is an opportunity and a time where we could sit in the same table, the Palestine and the Israelis together. These are my comments. Thank you very much. We still have a few minutes. I understand we have like 10 minutes, Shlomo, and we are supposed to comment on each other. Is there anything I have said that you would like to comment on?
Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate you for an excellent presentation of the situation in the Middle East. It is a very broad overview of the situation, but at the same time, very accurate and very penetrating. And I would like to amplify what you have said, especially about the long-standing conflicts between Sunnites and Shiites. I think that we are going to see the resurrection of this conflict. And in WikiLeaks, we learned that, you know, when the Secretary of State met with the local rulers of the Gulf states and asked them about the situation in the Middle East, they said the problem is not Israel. The problem is Iran. And if you ask people in Saudi Arabia today, they would say the same. The problem is not Israel, the problem is Iran. We are dealing naturally with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But for the Arab world, there is a major issue, a broader issue, and this is the map of the new Middle East. And as you have said, and I would like to amplify you once again, there is a high level of uncertainty that surrounds the developments in the Middle East, because we don't know what's going to happen with Iran, with Turkey, with the relations with them, and we don't know what's going to happen with the United States. You pointed out to the appointment of Mr. Chuck Hagel as the Secretary of the Defense Department. But we don't know what's going to happen with him, because he was against any American attack in Iran.
Yes.
He is unwilling to recognize the Iranian Guards as a terrorist group. So I'm asking myself, could it happen that for the sake of balance of power, the United States would look at the Middle East and say to itself, maybe this ongoing conflict between Sunnites and Shiites do serve our interests, and we have to keep it this way. And then my question to you would be, what would be the implications for Iran under such an assumption?
Well, the U.S. has another inducement to assume a hands-off position, and that is the hydrocarbon revolution they have at home.
Right.
They are becoming very rapidly less and less dependent from the Middle East and from the Gulf states. That doesn't mean that they could say that they do not have an interest on the region, but they will have a diminishing interest in the region. And that's one more factor to stay slightly away from leading today the situation. They will be very happy with an outcome in Syria that will weaken Iran, as the Saudi Arabians will, and as Qatar, another interesting new player in the Middle East, will also be. And I think that we have to be watching at some sort of series of parallel national calendars. I mean, yes, there are elections in June in Iran, But God knows where the Syrian conflict is going to be in mid-June. Is this going to last as much? Or is it as close to the end as some people believe? And the other country that could probably benefit from this conflict is also Russia. The Russians have their own domestic problem with their Islamic population. So there's a limit to what they may be willing to do to support the Syrian government. Because if their support of the Syrian government generates more instability at home, because we're going to be talking about, again, Sunnis, I mean, with their brothers fighting on the ground in Syria, thus generating their own problems inside the Russian borders. That may be one more reasons why the Russians at some point may say, enough is enough, we will stay away. But for the time being, they're a stumbling block. If it wouldn't be because of Russia and China, the international community would have probably had a chance to stop the carnage in Syria.
It's a very good point. You know, 2 weeks ago, the National Intelligence Council of the United States published a very interesting report. It is called Global Trends 2030. And they pointed out that in the coming 20 years, there would be two major foci, two major centers of conflict in the world. One would be South Asia, when we see it, you know, coming with China and Japan, and the conflict over, you know, the tiny islands and the resources. And the other conflict is the Middle East. And they raise a very interesting question. They are asking not what is going to happen to the Middle East, but whether the instability in the Middle East is going to spread and to turn into a global instability. So this means that the Middle East and South China and South Asia are at the same level, centers from which instability can spread to the rest of the world. And this is why I think that the United States, although it signaled that it's going to, you know, to diminish its role in the Atlantic and to move the center of gravity, the diplomatic activity, the military activity to the Pacific, because of the situation in the Middle East and because of the threats of a sort of a regional conflict that may turn into a broader conflict, has to ask ourselves, what is the role of the United States? Is the United States going to serve as the policeman of the world? Or maybe it's time for the United States to enjoy the resources, as you have suggested, and to say enough is enough. We spend so much money on this conflict. It's time for us to go and look inside. And I'm not sure about it, and the reason I'm raising this question is just to show that the Middle East conflict is associated with much broader conflicts.
Well, let me, reacting to the alert that we're running out of time, let me just maybe in finishing add a comment on the US. It is true what we have said about what everybody expects of Chuck Hagel's reaction on the region. But it is also true, in my view, that in the US, foreign policy is tied to a system more than to persons. For sure, defense has a word, but also the State Department has a word, also the National Security Council has a word, though the beliefs of one particular person tend to be less dramatic in the US than one may assume otherwise.
Right.
Thank you all for your attention and for coming to our presentation.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Good meeting you.
Muchas gracias, doctor Cárdenas, profesor Shlomo Hasson. Es increíble cuando tienen un background, una información base, qué fácil establecen una relación de sinergia. Así que muchas gracias por ambos presentations. Muchas gracias. Muy amable.